They might start out by falling into something, but then they might realize, oh, hang on a minute, why am I interested so much in this particular arena? What is it about this that drives me? And they might be curious then to go and dig more into the detail to understand about themselves. Now, I think it is pretty impossible to help others unless we have a deep understanding about ourselves, and unless we've taken that time out to self-reflect and ask ourselves those questions.
Well, hello, and welcome to Passion and Profits. I am joined today by Michelle Ensuque, who is outside of Marseille, France, and a place that I think is just quite lovely and can't wait to return to. Michelle, thank you for joining me and being here to share your expertise.
Thank you for asking me, Jacob.
Of course. This topic, I think, is fascinating and one that is, I think we could probably talk for hours and hours about it. And
Yeah,
and
probably.
perhaps we'll get the chance to do that for today. I want to dig into just starting with a definition. What is neuro linguistic programming?
So neuro-linguistic programming is a technique basically started by Richard Bandler, and it was where they monitored and looked at the patterns that what they considered best practice therapists to be using in terms of their results. So the results that they were getting were outstanding. They wanted to understand why that might be the case. They followed them, they looked at what they were doing, and they came up with these series of tools and techniques that could be used with individuals. And essentially, it looks at the conscious and subconscious mind. It looks at the way patterns form in people's behaviors. It looks at their language in terms of how they might use their language. And then looking at all those things and putting them together, it helps a coach guide and aid an individual to improve the situation that they're in, whatever situation that is. It's a little frustrating for me that it's not, well, it's well known, but it tends to fall in two camps. People absolutely hate it, and people absolutely love it. And I've not come across a huge amount of people that really know that much about it. And I think it's a real shame when you compare it to other therapies such as talking therapies, cognitive behavior therapy. I think it kind of earns its place alongside those, but it hasn't necessarily had the monetary investment behind it to investigate its efficacy and the outputs that individuals can make. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, very, very much. And so, sort of, if I can crudely summarize, it is becoming consciously aware of what we are unaware of and understanding how
Exactly.
that subconscious programming really drives our behaviors, our actions, the things we say, and what we really define as us. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's a perfect summary.
So I'm curious then, can you just share, because I really focus a lot on this idea of mindfulness and being aware of my present circumstances, my thoughts, my breath, things of that nature, my surroundings. How does neuro linguistic programming differ from simply being mindful?
Well, I think you can be mindful in the moment. I think I always thought I was mindful in the moment, as in I was present and future focused. I wasn't very past focused at all. if you like, I had a bit of a delete mentality where I didn't really think about the
Mm,
past. I didn't dwell on the past. I was always thinking about the here and now and the future. So in that space of being present here and now, that's fine. But if we have no understanding of how our past has affected us, you don't know what you don't know, right?
mm,
So you think that you are behaving in a particular way just because that's the way you're made, that's who you are, that is what you do. What I think can be a revelation to some people, and in my case it was that the reasons I was behaving in certain ways were because of my past, and they did drive me
mm.
to be very determined, to work very hard, over hard on times, to not give myself a break. So even when I was in the moment to me was probably quite brief. But I had no awareness that I could change those behaviors and that I could actually be even more present and really be at
Mhm,
peace with the person that I was, understand the reasons for those behaviors,
mm.
and actually just chip away at my kind of personality to avoid previous pitfalls that I found myself in. There's an awful lot on social media now about mindfulness, meditation. It's it they are that I think they are very good practices to do. I think the problem is if you don't know why you're doing it, or you're doing it because you've seen it and you think it's a jolly good idea, and you think it's good to relax your
Sure.
mind. So, okay, I'm going to practice 5 or 10 minutes meditation. Yes, you can be present, but if you return back to your hectic, busy, overwhelmed life 5 to 10 minutes later, that's not the same.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that distinction. And I think a lot of people mistake mindfulness for escapism and using
Mm,
a mindfulness practice to check out. And to your point, if we're just then going right back in, there's no actual discernible change, behavior change, or change of reality or circumstances, then it's no different than watching a television show or playing a video game or drinking alcohol or something else that we might do to escape.
exactly.
So,
Exactly.
Michelle, I want to bring this to some context that is applicable to our listeners. So, service leaders who are in the business of helping other people. In
Mm,
general, I can collectively say, are people who have a drive to help others, to do some good in the world. And oftentimes that comes through some amount of self sacrifice. And in
mm,
worst case scenarios, leads to burnout. Um, I think looking at it through this lens of subconscious programming, I'm wondering how much of those of us who are in the business of service or are helpers, as it might be called, are doing it because it's their personality, because it's a natural phenomena for them, or how much are people doing this because it's what they were programmed to do or told to do,
mm.
or told who they were, um, or the result of maybe an adaptation to something that they experienced when they were younger. What are your thoughts on that?
Mm. I think it can be a mix. I think we're not all the same. We're all unique. We have different backgrounds. We have different expectations, different cultures, different experiences, and different advice over the years from various role models, be it our parents, teachers, friends, whatever. Um, and I think there is something about being service leaders where you could say, well, okay, that type of personality has a need to rescue people, to make sure that everything is okay with everybody, to nurture, to care, to almost gather everybody in and hold them close to enable those people to be better people. Perhaps sometimes because they have learned from their own experiences and want to impart that advice to others. Sometimes it is just because it's the very thing that they find is their strength, and they find that people will listen to them.
Mhm.
So a lot of it is down to how people tune into you as a person. If you find you have rapport with people and you find it easy to communicate with people and you're interested in the psyche and everything else, it all can build in a very subliminal way to wanting to help others. But for each person, the reason for doing that can be very, very different. I would suspect that, for instance, if you were in the category of something that happened to you when you were younger, and then you had a view that you wanted to prevent other people going through the pain or sacrifice or whatever that you had particularly gone through. I think
Mhm.
we need to be careful with that, because my experience, of course, is not the same as somebody else's experience or somebody else's experience. So I think it can be very
Right.
complex because it's very individualistic based.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Uh, and I think for many of us who are service leaders, we are driven by those experiences, um,
Mm.
meaning that yeah, it was a painful, oftentimes, or traumatic experience. And so, yeah, of course, we want to help others avoid that. Um, I think the what we want to suss out here is, are we doing this as a conscious decision, and understanding
Mm.
why we're making that decision, and what is the intersectionality of experiences, skill sets, personality, all of the things that you mentioned, versus being driven to do this work as a coping mechanism, as a way of maybe healing from past trauma, or making up for past wrongs, or whatever it may be. I don't want to be trite in my my description. There's, like you said, a wide variety of people and reasons why people come to this work. But that's what I want to dig into today with you, is really understanding um, why we do what we do, and ensuring that we are making a decision and not just falling into something, or something that we're doing, certainly on a career level, is just a result of a headlong stumble into the
Yeah,
path that we're already on.
I think, yeah,
So
I think a
how
lot of us have been there in
go
terms
ahead.
of stumbling, stumbling into something. Um,
Oh,
I think
absolutely. There's no judgment there.
that there's nuance here, I think, because I think it is entirely possible for people to start out falling into something because it feels right, but they don't know why it feels right. Or they're very good at what they do. They may not know why they're good at what they're doing. There
Mhm.
could, but I think it depends at what point in your life you start doing those things. So it's quite interesting. Of all the people that I meet on LinkedIn, for instance, who are in the service or providing assistance for others, it is 99% of the time because they have had personal experiences that they want others to
Yep.
learn from. However,
Yep.
sometimes I think, and we can give people advice, sure, but sometimes we learn best from our own experiences. So I'm not saying to people, well, you can't do any of the things that we're kind of warning you about, because that would not be right. We need to learn by our own experiences. However, I think there are people who have learned different things along the way. So different different elements of their pathways, for instance, they might start out by falling into something, but then they might realize, oh, hang on a minute, why am I interested so much in this particular arena? What is it about this that drives me?
Mhm.
And they might be curious then to go and dig more into the detail to understand about themselves. Now, I think it is pretty impossible to help others unless we have a deep understanding about ourselves, and unless we've taken that time out to self-reflect and ask ourselves those questions. Because that would, if we don't do those things, for me, that then doesn't feel right to be in that space to be a service leader for other people.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think you're saying that we need to be perfect or even fully healed
No,
necessarily, but we do have to have that awareness and have to have that search to really understand at least who we are in
I
order to.
also think that there might be a clear indicator sometimes for people, because uh, if we're in a job of being a service leader and we're providing a service for others, and we find that we are getting either more emotional, or um, we're judging somebody for their situation, or we're feeling, I don't want to say angry, but frustration with their situation, then that would be a trigger for me, I think. What is it about that in this space that is providing that trigger for me? And I think that's why I talk about self-reflection, because I have come across people who have been in that industry, and they have got quite frustrated with certain individuals who have come to them. And this is where I come back to rapport between
Yeah,
people as well. And often I kind of, it tends to be the kind of coaching scenario where you have people telling people what they think they should do, which is not my style, but it can be somebody else's style. And then taking offense or being frustrated if that person doesn't take their advice, etc. So I think there's a little flag to say that if you feel that frustration, that might be a good point. Or if you are feeling overwhelmed and overworked and um, you feel you can't continue listening to people's problems, that might be a point to reflect and go, why might that be the case?
yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that, and just a personal anecdote. I used to do a lot of one-on-one or small group coaching, and had to walk away from it for quite some time, and that also coincided with professional development for me. Uh, but I, was at a point in my life where it was doing me more harm than good,
Mm,
meaning that
mm,
the feel good parts of helping people um, were not overshadowing the emotional toll that it was taking on me, or what I
yeah,
was maybe challenged by during that time. It was bumping
yeah,
into that for me, and I had to
mm,
step away for a period of time, and I think that's what we're talking about here is that awareness. So I'd love to dig into um, how do we start to become aware of this subconscious, because like you said, we don't know what we don't know. um, so
mm.
I imagine that everyone listening wants to know, um, how do they start that journey?
So I think, I mean, I've already mentioned some flags that I would look for. So if I look back at my own personal example, I was a driver. I was very determined. I worked very hard. I'd been brought up to believe that you work hard for everything in this life. Nothing in this life comes free. We can think of a million
Hmm.
phrases around that. Um,
Sure.
I think my mum used to say, if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing yourself. So everything about my background had taught me that I had to work hard, very hard. I mustn't take anything for granted. I must do everything around the house. I must look after my kids. And um, I never really stopped and thought, if this was somebody else in my situation, and I could see them running themselves ragged, working all the hours God
Hmm.
sends, looking after two boys, being a single parent, trying to be perfect around the house, not really having a social life, what would I say to that person? Because chances are, if that was your best mate, you would be reading the riot act. You would be going, what do you think you are doing? Because this is not
Yeah.
sustainable. But when it comes to ourselves, for some reason, we think we've got the Superman cape. We seem to think that we can just continue in that way. So my my main tip is to imagine that you can see either a double version of you in the same room or a friend of yours, but apply the same life for them that you are currently running, and just have a look to see
Mm.
what that would look like. Imagine what that would look like.
Yeah.
And if you could imagine that they were there with you, what kinds of things would you be saying to them? Would you be asking them questions like, is it absolutely necessary, for example, to do all the work you're doing? If you could do something in a different way, what could you do?
Yeah.
If you had choices, what things would you change? It's asking those open-ended questions to prod the person into thinking. We are more than capable of actually answering those questions ourselves. It's just easier if you take it out of your head and pop it somewhere else, so that it feels like you are asking somebody else the question. It feels less emotional and just
Mhm.
more logical and factual. And the answer will come back very instinctively. Well, I could change my working day. I could get takeout tonight. I could see if I could find help for someone to look after the children. There would be probably quite a long list of things that you could do, but it's the fact that we never really ask ourselves. We just continue thinking it's our responsibility to do all of those things.
Right. Right. So it becomes necessary to start to view ourselves from the outside. We have to be able to look at
Yeah.
ourselves as if we were someone else, as a third party, in order to step out of the cycle that we sometimes get in of
Yes.
do or have to. Those are have tos and shoulds. As they say, stop shoulding on
Oh,
yourself,
yeah.
because it's just leading to this
Yeah.
cycle, right?
Yeah. And actually, that's a good point about the language. If we start to notice that we're using I need to, I have to, I should do, those are drivers. Those are very strong drivers for continuing actions, continuing practices that are invariably, well, look, it's not always bad. I'm not saying that, if I need to go shopping, is that a bad thing? I'm not saying that using that language all the time is bad. But if it's, I need to do this, I have to do this, very often what I ask is, so what? If you don't do those things, what
Yeah,
happens? And in reality, actually not a lot. But until we're physically
yeah.
asked that question, we imagine the world will end. We imagine that something terrible is going to
What's the
happen
worst
because
case
our
scenario?
imagination is much more powerful.
Yeah.
It goes to the worst case. Whereas if we actually say, so what? What if you don't do those things? The brain has to go, oh, actually, I don't know, or not a lot, and it can be quite surprising. Hey, the brain can actually kind of just go, well, I actually don't know the answer to that question. So it's really interesting to just do that stopping and thinking and reflecting and asking questions. Now, sometimes that's more useful with a coach if you don't necessarily um, have the tools per se, or are comfortable or confident in doing that. Sometimes it can be useful to see a coach or somebody in that sphere who could help you. But once you've got
Yeah.
the basis of that, we can then stop and go, actually, do you know what? I'm I'm sure there's a different way of doing that. So let me just stop for a moment and think about it. I think it's just our human nature that we don't tend to stop. We just tend to keep going.
Yeah. So, what I'm hearing you say is first we need to become aware of the flags, what
Yeah.
those signals are, and that can be language, can be that I would imagine feeling overwhelmed, or feeling like, somehow we can't catch up. Um, those
Yeah.
those flags are a signal that we need to make a change.
Yeah.
And then once
Yes.
once we do, then it's it's coming to a place of rest, right? Stopping and asking, or bringing in this strategy of what what if, what would happen, or as you said, so what.
Mm, mm, yeah. And I think, when you talk about the flags, uh, I could almost project myself back to where I was, in that I used to call it being on a hamster wheel. I just felt like I was running,
Hmm.
running, running, running all the time without a break. The real benefit of the so what is that it's almost a way for the brain to take a breath. It's to have a mini pause, to just stop and think, which you normally don't give ourselves time to do. I think there is nuance
Yeah.
in terms of, there's a lot of negativity associated with going slower, taking time out, doing
Hmm.
things perhaps in a different way. Certainly, the world that I was in project management, and the project management style was,
Hmm.
you did lots of hours, you worked really hard, you were task orientated, activity orientated, and I think in the corporate world, there is an expectation of a certain
Sure.
performance workload. And then there's negativity associated with not necessarily working to the norm. So that's why I say it can be difficult for people to ask themselves those questions, because I would bet most people deep down know that the situation that they have found themselves in is not great, but they want to be
Right.
seen to be coping, so they just keep going.
Yeah, because action or doing is, I think, the ultimate distraction. Because if we're busy, then we don't have time to think or to feel bad about what we're doing. But it's a trap. Busy does not
Yeah,
equal productive or effective. It's
no,
can be just a space filler. I'm thinking about um, the beginning of the year for me. Uh, January into February is a tough time for me for many reasons. Living in a northern state where there's limited light, um, that certainly affects my mood. Not being able to get outside, be as active after the holidays and after the new year. There's just this inevitable sort of like letdown of not having exciting things happening, and then the pressure of, this is a new year, new you. You have all of these, resolutions and plans and goals for the upcoming year. It also coincides with the anniversary of my birth father's suicide, of my anniversary of the death of a dear friend, and it's just generally a very hard time for me. And I find near mid the end of January every year, I'm just feeling down, depressed, apathetic,
mm,
lethargic, and I can't focus, I can't get things done. And traditionally, I've been really hard on myself, um, and really just critical of my inability to get going, because it's the new year, and of course, like, I need to get going. And this year, I had some awareness going into the year to say, every year this cycle repeats, and each year I go through this same routine, and I find myself, February, mid February, finally coming out of it and being like, "Whew, that was awful," and I just made it worse on myself. So this year, I actually took time off, and I allowed myself to just be, to just experience.
yeah,
And it wasn't as though I I did no work. I did some, but um, certainly the level of output that I uh, enjoy, I didn't do, and was so much better for it. So this is just a small little case study of to affirm what you're saying. That sort of being aware first is really what's necessary. Understanding the flags, and then stopping and reflecting. And I absolutely asked myself that question, like, what's the worst thing that's going to happen if I take time off? If I'm not busy, if I'm not quote unquote productive, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? And when we
Mm.
go through those scenarios, understanding that, like, in reality, um, that probably is not going to be the case. And as it turns out, it wasn't. And in fact, I was better off for it. And now, coming into this season, I'm doing better than ever, better than usual, certainly. So, um,
Well, I'm sorry to hear about your birth father. My own mother committed suicide actually when I was 7 months pregnant. So, and I didn't
mm,
know that about your dad. So I can empathise
mm,
with that. And I think that is a typical example actually where um, I don't know how I felt at the time. I certainly didn't grieve. And because I was pregnant, I think I shut my brain down to protect my baby and continued
sure.
life as normal. And I never took time out about that. And I think, when I look back at the different experiences that I've had, and I'm, a coper, I thought it was a strength to cope and get through those difficult situations.
Sure.
Um, I think it takes greater strength to actually self-reflect and stop and take time out like you've done, Jacob. So hats off to you. But I do really think that it's something that we in our society at the moment, for me, life seems to be getting faster and faster and faster. Greater pressure, greater social media influence, and pressure to succeed, to not stop. I mean, only this morning
Yeah.
I was looking at a LinkedIn video where somebody was saying, "Oh, I don't need any sleep. I've got a 1 year old. I had 4 hours sleep and I can function perfectly fine." Well, okay, you may be able to for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, but
A short
how
period of
long is that
time.
going to continue for, and is it sustainable? Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think there's this bravado around us coping and continuing, keep going, when in fact
Yeah.
we're not machines, eh?
No, and that's a quite a toxic perspective. And as the father of a now 1 year old, I can say it's been an incredibly difficult year. And I didn't realize how well I slept before, how much I took sleep for granted before, and what a premium it is in my life. But I think, the person that you spoke of, like, right, yes, you can continue, and you can potentially do your work and perform, but at what cost to your health, but more
Yeah.
importantly, at what cost to your relationships? Because there is,
Mm,
when we are at sleep deficit, there is many, many chemical reactions that happen inside of our body, that and inside of our brain, that lead to lessened ability to be able to manage stress, to be able to create all
mm,
the neurochemicals, transmitters that we need to keep our mood elevated, but to engage in relationships in a healthy, thoughtful way. And that's what I have found over the last year, was the first thing to go for me, was my patience, was
mm,
my filter, the space that I would leave in between my thoughts and my actions, or my thoughts and my words. And that absolutely has an impact on relationships, but especially with these little ones, it has a permanent impact on their development. Like we were talking about pre-show, my wife and I were just having this discussion about not wanting to ruin our son, and wanting him to have a healthy attachment style and to really just have a secure sense of self. Um, he recently started
Mm.
going to to a daycare center at the Montessori school, and it's been a difficult transition for him to go and spend 3 days a week there. And it's really good for all of us, because we need
Yes.
time. He needs independence and a sense of self. Um, but we were talking about this fact that um, up to 75% of our personality is developed by the age of 3.
Yeah.
And a lot of that happens so early that we don't remember it in our adulthood.
No.
So who we are is determined largely by things we will never remember in our lives. And those who have the biggest influence on that are, of course, our parents, and the amount of time that they
Yeah.
spend, the words that they use, the tone that they use, the whether or not they pick you up when you start crying, or need something. Like, all of this affects who we are and how we are able to healthfully connect with other adults when we grow up. Um, so yeah, I digress on all of that. It's
No, no, no.
obviously something that's
I was just going
very,
to say,
very present
because
in my mind.
no, I was just going to say that it's so true, because obviously I say obviously like everyone knows, but I know my upbringing was not ideal. I think that's putting it lightly. Um, and I think that was the very reason why I ended up breaking and having or experiencing burnout and having depression, because, as you said, I had I have memory of what has happened in so I suffered physical abuse and psychological abuse from my parents, but I had no memory
Mhm.
really of what happened pre-7. Um, but
Yeah.
I marched forth into the world, I thought, complete as a person with very good morals, very good work ethic, and had absolutely no idea of the psychological impacts on me and my future relationships with others, men, colleagues, friends, whatever. Um, the physical impacts on me as a person in terms of how I then drove myself, absolutely no idea at all. I just thought I was me. So I think, when we're talking about how would someone know, well, with hindsight, of course I could tell that I was running out of steam and, on the hamster wheel and feeling fatigued, but I literally had no idea what to do. No idea. And unfortunately, I think many people get to a situation where they end up breaking, because they don't have that support network, they don't have that advice, they don't have any outside kind of assistance that could alert them to the fact that actually these could be poor behaviors that might result in burnout, in depression, in whatever, of course, which is a long road to recovery potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate you sharing your story. And I think, as someone, my birth father died by suicide when I was 6 years old. So I think, similarly to you, I don't remember a lot before that. And a lot of what I have over time attributed to just being my personality, being the eldest of 33 cousins, and someone who is driven and strong and athletic and sort of tireless. Now I'm realizing, oh, those were coping mechanisms and techniques.
Yeah.
And actually,
Yeah.
as I've gotten to know myself better, certainly through becoming a father has helped me with that process. Um, I've come to realize that some of the things that I just took for granted as being me, like who I thought was me, um, were things that were actually just thrust upon me by circumstances. And and I think, to your earlier point, um, going through and doing that analysis sort of from the third party perspective, or if you need help with that, working with a coach or a therapist or trusted advisor for that process, can be really helpful, because then you can choose, what do I want to keep and what can I let go? What
Mm,
actually belongs
yes.
to me, and what is
Yeah.
something that I can leave in the past. And I think that brings
Yeah.
us full circle to this idea, that you have to include the past in this process in order to
Yeah.
truly understand who you are in the present day.
And I think we've said before, this isn't about becoming the perfect person, the perfect parent, the perfect friend and colleague. I think this is
Right.
just being, it's adding a layer of richness to something that potentially wasn't there before. Once you pull in that understanding of why you might be behaving in a certain way, it isn't necessarily, as you said, about deleting those behaviors, but at least then you can take some control and say, well, actually, what's useful for me right now? What isn't useful for
Hmm.
me? And what should I do with that? Now, in terms of what therapy, what tools and techniques are out there, I don't bang on about neurolinguistic programming being the panacea to world peace. It just happens to be something that works very, very quickly for certain individuals. And I would
Right.
encourage people to try it if they've not heard of it before. But if it doesn't work for individuals, there are a zillion other things that people can try that actually does fit with their personality type or the way that they work much better. It's just about trying something.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that, Michelle. As we wrap up here, I can see it's become dusk there in the south of France, and I want to give you the time you need to rest. So, what would be the biggest takeaway for someone listening, or a next step, an action item that someone could take to get started on this process? What's something that they could do right now today to begin?
I think writing a list would be a really useful way of just having time set aside to just write down what elements of my life would I like to improve if I had the opportunity today. Because I think in writing that, the brain has to go to, well, what don't I like at the moment? Well, I'm too busy. Well, okay, if I had an opportunity, then how could I become less busy? So it's a positive reinforcement of a potentially negative situation. Um, and then I'm not suggesting we have 20 things on the list, but let's just say we've got half a dozen things on the list. It's then going back to those
Sure.
things and trying to do, as I said before, which is imagine that's the situation for, if we disassociate it, imagine that's the situation for somebody else. If that person is overworking, what advice would you give that person to reduce their workload? Because immediately you'll get the answer back.
Mhm.
And I think that's just a really healthy way of disassociating it from self, landing it in a place that is not emotional. It's not demanding that I change
Yeah.
anything in this moment. All it's saying is, that's interesting. I notice that that person is really struggling with the amount of work that they're doing. I wonder what might help
Yeah.
them and what could I ask them? What advice could I give them to help improve that situation? And you just do that working down the list, and then you just sit back and you listen to the information that you take back in. The difficulty with us, I think, as humans is that whilst we're driving and coping and moving forward all the time, we're not actually listening to the inner voice. And the inner voice is usually trying to prompt us and tell us and give us warnings about
Mm.
things that are potentially not great for us. But we tend to slap it away and
Yeah.
just go, yeah, okay, I'll just carry straight on. But giving yourself the time to just
Yeah.
sit and reflect with that feedback and thinking about what you might want to do with that, I think that would be a really good start.
Yeah. And in order to hear that voice, we have to be quiet. We have to create
Yeah,
the space to be able to
yeah.
actually listen to that voice. Michelle, you have a gift for some listeners today. Can you share a little bit about that and how
Yeah, sure.
people might um, connect with you if they'd like to?
Okay, sure. I've recently written a book. In fact, it went live on the 1st of April. It's called The Silent Child in Me. And literally it's the story in my life. It's okay, it's based in tragedy and sadness, but actually the end result is really positive. And it doesn't fixate, as I've said, on NLP. It opens up the opportunities to discuss various things. It shows the impact of my upbringing into different areas such as relationships, my self-esteem, my attitude towards exercise, my attitude towards dieting, my mum's suicide, and all those things. But actually, I think there's one chapter that's called oh my god, I forgot what it's called now. My Knight in Shining Armor, which was NLP. So for me, NLP was transformational. At the end of each chapter, I just ask 6 NLP type questions for people, just to prod the subconscious, just to get people starting to think about the way they're working, the way they're driving, the impacts of potential things in the past that might have happened to them, and what that might mean for them right now. It's not a self-help book as in, I think you should do this. It isn't like that. It's purely just to prod the subconscious in an NLP way. So I have 5 copies for any of your listeners who would like a copy. They can get hold of me either through Michelle at Melius, which is MEL IUSSE.com. So Michelle at Melius.com, or they can find me, Michelle Ensuque, on LinkedIn. And any way they want to contact me like that, I'm happy to send them a copy of my book. So the first 5, and then just
Fantastic.
get them to
Very
send me
generous.
their name and address.
Cheers.
That's
That's
fine.
that's very very generous, and thank you for doing that. And we'll include links to all of your profiles in the show notes as well. So anyone who wants to connect with you will be able to do so. Michelle, thank you so much for your
Great.
time. I
Thank you,
really
Jacob.
appreciate it, and thanks for sharing your story and your expertise with our listeners.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.